Hello and welcome to Ms. Pam Reed's Christian Content, where we are continuing in our story, All's for the Best by T.S. Arthur. In our last video, we basically continued with the seamstress, Mary Carson, and the conversation with her employer, Mrs. Wyckoff, about her health and Mrs. Wyckoff's concern for her health. "There is something wrong here, Mary," said Mrs. Wyckoff, with increasing sobriety of manner. "Something very wrong, and as I look it steadily in the face, I feel both surprised and troubled. For after what you have just said, I do not see clearly how it is to be remedied. One thing is certain, if you, as a class, accept without remonstrance the hurt you suffer, there will be no change. People are indifferent and thoughtless, or worse, too selfish to have any regard for others, especially if they stand socially on a plane below them." "We cannot apply the remedy," answered Miss Carson. "I'm not sure of that. Just look at it for a moment, Mrs. Wyckoff. It is admitted that for the preservation of health, orderly habits are necessary, and that food should be taken at regular intervals. Suppose that at home, my habit is to eat breakfast at 7, dinner at 1, and supper at 6. Today, such is the order of my meals, but tomorrow I leave home at 6:30 and sit down on an empty stomach to sew until 8. Before I am called to breakfast. After that, I work until 2, when I get my dinner, and at 7, drink tea. On the day after that, maybe on my arrival at another house where a day's cutting and fitting is wanted, I find the breakfast awaiting me at 7. This suits very well, but not another mouthful of food passes my lips until after 3 o'clock, and maybe then I have such an inward trembling and exhaustion that I cannot eat. On the day following, the order is again changed. So it goes on. The difference in food, too, is often as great. On the day following, at some houses, everything is of good quality, well cooked, and in consequence of easy digestion, while at others, sour or heavy bread, greasy cooking, and like kitchen abominations, if I must so call them, disorder instead of giving sustenance to a frail body like mine. The seamstress who should attempt to change of these things for her own special benefit would soon find herself in hot water. Think a moment. Suppose going into a family for 1 or 2 days a week, or 1 or 2 days or a week, I should begin by a request to have my meals served at certain hours, 7, 1, and 6, for instance. How would it be received in 8 out of 10 families? "Something would depend," said Mrs. Wyckoff, "on the way in which it was done." Adjusting the pages. "If there was a formal stipulation or a cold demand, I do not think the response would be a favorable one. But I am satisfied that in your case, with the signs of poor health on your countenance, the mild request to be considered as far as practical would be in almost every instance received in a kind return." "Perhaps so, but it would make trouble, if nowhere else, with servants who never like to do anything out of common order. I have been living around long enough to understand how such things operate, and generally it is wisest to take what comes and make the best of it." "Say rather the worst of it, Mary. To my thinking, you are making the worst of it." But Mrs. Wyckoff did not inspire her seamstress with any purpose to act in the line of her suggestions. Her organization was of too sensitive a character to accept the shocks and repulses that she knew would attend in some quarters any such intrusion of her individual wants. Even with all the risks upon her, she preferred to suffer whatever might come, rather than ask for consideration. During the 2 or 3 days that she remained with Mrs. Wyckoff, that excellent lady watched her and ministered to her actual wants with all the tender solicitude of a mother, and when she left, tried to impress upon her mind the duty of asking, whatever she might be, for such consideration as her health required. The Monday morning on which Mary Carson was to appear bright and early at the dwelling of Mrs. Lowe came around, but it was far from being a bright morning. An easterly storm had set in during the night. The rain was falling fast and the wind driving gustily. A chilliness crept through the frame of Miss Carson as she arose from her bed. Soon after, the dull light began to creep in drearily through the half-closed shutters of her room. The air, even within her chamber, felt cold, damp, and penetrating. From her window, a steeple clock was visible. She glanced at the face and saw that it was nearly 7. "So late as that!" she exclaimed in a tone of surprise, and commenced dressing herself in a hurried, nervous way. By the time she was ready to leave her room, she was exhausted by her own excited haste. "Mary," said a kind voice, calling to her as she was moving down the stairs, "you are not going out this morning?" "Oh, yes, ma'am," she answered in a cheerful voice. "I have an engagement for today." "But the storm is too severe. It's raining and blowing dreadfully. Wait an hour or two until it holds up a little." "Oh, dear, no, Mrs. Grant. I can't stop for a trifle of rain." "It's no trifle of rain this morning, let me tell you, Mary. You'll get drenched to the skin. Now don't go out, child." "I must indeed, Mrs. Grant. The lady expects me and I cannot disappoint her." And Miss Carson kept on down the stairs. "But you are not going to without something on your stomach, Mary. Wait just for a few minutes until I can get you a cup of tea. The water is boiling." So Mrs. Grant may be a neighbor or a landlady watching out for her. Mary did not wait. It was already past the time when she was expected at Mrs. Lowe's, and besides, feeling a little uncomfortable on that account, she had a slight sense of nausea, with its attendant aversion to food. So breaking away from Mrs. Grant's concerned importunities, she went forth into the cold, driving storm. It so happened that she had to go for nearly the entire distance of 6 or 7 blocks, almost in the teeth of the wind, which blew a gale, drenching her clothes in spite of all efforts to protect herself by means of an umbrella. Her feet and ankles were wet by the time she reached Mrs. Lowe's, and the lower parts of her dress and underclothing saturated to a depth of 10 or 12 inches. So, they wear those long skirts. So she's got like a foot of wet clothes now. "I expected you half an hour ago," said the lady in a coldly polite way as Miss Carson entered her presence. "The morning was dark and I overslept myself," was the only reply. Mrs. Lowe did not remark upon the condition of Mary's clothing and feet. That was a matter of no concern to her. It was a seamstress, not a human being, that was before her, a machine, not a thing of sensation. Wow. So she conducted her to a room in the 3rd story, fronting east against the cloudy and misty windows of which the rain and wind were driving. There was a damp, chilly feeling in the air of this room. Mrs. Lowe had a knit shawl drawn around her shoulders, but Mary, after removing her bonnet and cloak, had no external protection for her chest beyond the closely fitting body of her merino dress. Her feet and hands felt very cold, and she had that low shuddering experienced when one is inwardly chilled. Mrs. Lowe was ready for her seamstress. There were the materials to make half a dozen dresses for Angela and Grace, and one of the little misses was called immediately, and the work of selecting and cutting a body pattern commenced. Mrs. Lowe herself, superintending the operation, and embarrassing Mary at the start with her many suggestions. Nearly an hour had been spent in this way when the breakfast bell rang. It was after 8 o'clock. Without saying anything to Mary, Mrs. Lowe and the children and the child they had been fitting went downstairs. This hour had been one of nervous excitement to Mary Carson. Her cheeks were hot, burning as if a fire shone upon them, but her cold hands and wet, colder feet sent the blood in every returning circle, robbed of warmth, to the disturbed heart. It was past 9 when the servant called Mary to breakfast. As she arose from her chair, she felt a sharp stitch in her left side, so sharp that she caught her breath in half inspirations 2 or 3 times before venturing on a full inflation of the lungs. She was at the same time conscious of an uncomfortable tightness across the chest. The nausea and loathing of food, which had given place soon after her arrival at Mrs. Lowe's to a natural craving of the stomach for food, had returned again, and she felt as she went downstairs that unless something to tempt the appetite were set before her, she could not take a mouthful. There was nothing to tempt the appetite. The table at which the family had eaten remained just as they had left it. Soiled plates and scraps of broken bread and meat, partly emptied cups and saucers, dirty knives and forks spread about in confusion. Amid all this, a clean plate had been set for the seamstress, and Mrs. Lowe awaited her, cold and dignified, at the head of the table. "Coffee or tea, Miss Carson?" "Coffee." It was a lukewarm decoction of spent coffee grounds, flavored with tin and sweetened to nauseousness. Mary took a mouthful and swallowed, put the cup again to her lips, but they resolutely refused to unclose and admit another drop. So she sat the cup down. "Help yourself to some of the meat," and Mrs. Lowe pushed the dish, which nearly 3/4 of an hour before had come upon the table bearing a smoking sirloin, across to the seamstress. Now, lying beside the bone and cemented by the dish to a stratum of chilled gravy, was the fat, stringy end of the steak. The sight of it was enough for Miss Carson, and she declined the offer delicacy. "There's bread." She took a slice from a fresh baker's loaf and spread it with some oily-looking butter that remained on one of the butter plates. It was slightly sour. By forcing herself, she swallowed 2 or 3 mouthfuls, but the remonstrating palate would accept no more. "Isn't the coffee good?" asked Mrs. Lowe, with a sharp quality in her voice, seeing that Miss Carson did not venture upon a second mouthful. "I have very little appetite this morning," was answered, with an effort to smile and look cheerful. "Perhaps you'd rather have tea. Shall I give you a cup?" And Mrs. Lowe laid her hand on the teapot. "You may, if you please." Mary felt inward weakness that she knew was occasioned by a lack of food, and so accepted the offer of tea in the hope that it might prove palatable more than the coffee. It had the merit of being hot and not of decidedly offensive flavor, but it was little more in strength than sweetened water whitened with milk. She drank off the cup and then left the table, going with her still wet feet and skirts to the sewing room. "Rather a dainty young lady," she heard Mrs. Lowe remark to the waiter as she left the room. The stitch in Mary's side caught her again as she went up the stairs and almost took her breath away, and it was some time after she resumed her work before she could bear her body up straight on the left side. In her damp feet and skirts on a chilly and rainy October day, Mary Carson sat working until 3 o'clock without rest or refreshment of any kind, and when at last called to dinner, the disordered condition of the table and the cold, unpalatable food set before her extinguished instead of stimulating her sickly appetite. She made a feint of eating to avoid attracting attention and then returned to the sewing room, the air of which, as she re-entered, seemed colder than that of the hall and dining room. The stitch in her side was not so bad during the afternoon, but the dull pain was heavier and accompanied by a sickening sensation. Still, she worked on, cutting, fitting, and sewing with a patience and industry that, considering her actual condition, was surprising. Mrs. Lowe was in and out of the room frequently, overlooking the work and marking its progress. Beyond the producing power of her seamstress, she had no thought of that individual. It did not come within the range of her questionings whether she were well or ill, weak or strong, exhausted by prolonged labor, or in full possession of bodily vigor. To her, she was simply an agent through which a certain service was obtained, and beyond that service, she was nothing. The extent of her consideration was limited to the progressive creation of dresses for her children. As that went on, her thought dwelt with Miss Carson, but penetrated no deeper. She might be human, might have an individual life full of wants, yearnings, and tender sensibilities, might be conscious of bodily or mental suffering, but if so, it was in a region so remote from that in which Mrs. Lowe dwelt that no intelligence thereof reached her. Wow. And that's our stopping spot because it's been about 17 minutes. Goodness, such a difference between Mrs. Wyckoff and Mrs. Lowe, but I think we probably sensed that back in the beginning when they met. So we're still going to continue in our next video with Mary Carson as a seamstress who's not feeling well. All right, you guys, I hope you have a blessed day, and I will see you next time.